Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. From Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and the palatial FYC studio, you're listening to For Your Consideration.
The podcast featuring roundtable discussions reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics. I'm your host, Dustin.
And I'm your host, Mike Josic. We'd like to give a shout out to anybody catching the show on iHeartRadio, Stitcher, YouTube. We're on Spotify now. You can find us on Spotify, people, if you're not listening to us on Spotify right now. And if you're catching us on iTunes while you're there, we'd love it if you rated and reviewed the show. 5 stars is always preferable, but
I prefer honesty.
Vote with how you feel. Yeah, it just helps with the algorithms and getting us into the podcast standings over on Apple Podcasts, and helps get the show into the eyes and ears of people who might be interested in our show but don't know that we're out there. If you're a regular listener to the show, welcome back. If this is your first time catching our podcast, be warned, spoilers ahead.
Though at a certain point, if you are worried about spoilers while watching a review for a 20-year-old film, that's on you.
So as we discussed on our last episode, this episode is not technically officially part of our October Fright Fest Spooktacular, although technically it is a horror movie, but not a very scary one.
Depending on who you ask, of course. If you ask the wrong people, they say it's very scary. Possibly the 3rd scariest movie of all time, according to
Hollywood Reporter.
Yeah.
And that film, the film in question, is Dustin's pick for this go-around of the roundtable, and that's the Blair Witch Project.
AKA, who you can blame for viral marketing and shaky cam.
My brother actually got physically sick watching this movie because of all the motion. I personally don't get it. I don't feel that, but...
I mean, I get car sick myself, but this one didn't have that much motion in it. There was some in the running scenes, but... There's definitely shaky cam films that are far worse than this in terms of the camera motions.
It could also be that there wasn't a lot of like real verite style filmmaking that we were seeing on the big screen for general audiences, whereas now it's like so common. Maybe we're more acclimated to it. I don't know.
It was never a problem for me to begin with, but
yeah,
no. Some people have the issue. We do not. Warning: car sickness ahead.
So let's run the credits on this movie, and we'll get into the discussion of the Blair Witch Project, which was directed by Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez, produced by Robert Cowie and Greg Hale. It was written by Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez, starred Heather Donahue, Michael C. Williams, and Joshua Leonard. Music was by Antonio Cora. Cinematography was by Neil Fredericks. It was edited by Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez. It was distributed by Artisan Entertainment, got a January 25th, 1999 Sundance release, and had a wide release in the U.S. on July 14th, 1999. The film was a phenomenon. It grossed $250 million off of a $60,000 budget. It's considered one of the most successful independent films of all time. It's credited with at least popularizing the whole found footage genre of horror films.
Subgenre, sir.
And is widely regarded by many people as one of the scariest films of all time.
I don't know who those people are. I know a few of them. They are wrong. There's no gentle way to put it.
And where does the film sit on the Sight and Sound list, Dustin?
It is hanging out at 546th on the director's poll, which makes it critically more acclaimed than Martyrs, I guess.
Just banging that drum.
Just banging that drum.
So that's a single director vote for Bence Fleegolf.
Banging that drum.
I have not heard this. I have not heard of this gentleman, but yeah. So it's on the list. So we're doing it, and Dustin picked it. The media that we watched it on was the Artisan DVD release that came out October 22nd, 1999. Actually, not a bad DVD release if you excuse the film portion of it. Decent commentaries, some decent features on it. And I'll probably be dropping some mention of those said features, as we go through our discussion. But speaking of discussion, did you have something you wanted to add before we...
To add?
You have like this diving in look.
I thought that was... We begin before we can start adding stuff.
All right. So to begin, Dustin, what is the Blair Witch Project and what did you think of it?
The Blair Witch Project is one of what we see a whole lot of nowadays, found footage film that somebody just happened to, stumble upon, edit nicely, and then release in major theaters across the country. Following a documentarian and little film crew who are going out to check out the Blair Witch, who is supposed to have killed a number of people about 100 odd years ago. And the weird thing is you get a couple different stories from the townsfolk because they start talking about, there was some guy who killed some teenagers. Some others talk about the Blair Witch. Some talk about some sightings. But they end up getting lost in the woods in a way that seems potentially supernatural. They're harassed during the night.
Did you genuinely get that sense, though?
Of what?
Sorry, this is probably more for the discussion aspect of it, but I felt that there was a sincere lack of the sense of the supernatural in this film.
Potentially supernaturally lost in the sense that if you're traveling for one
ostensibly supernaturally
ostensibly
lost.
Is that not what I said? Regardless, everybody. And they end up essentially dead in a cabin in the woods. The film ends without you necessarily knowing exactly what happens to everyone, other than there was a lot of screaming and dropping of cameras.
It's a cabin in the woods movie minus the cabin. The house shows up very briefly at the end.
Very briefly. And here's the thing. My memory of my first viewing of the film, I don't even remember the house. When Mike is standing in the corner of the basement at the very end, for some reason my memory has him out in a courtyard and a low stone fence of possibly a crumbling house.
You know where I think that comes from?
I don't know why.
As you were describing that, Dustin and I had this conversation off mic previous to watching the film. But we were also talking about Blair Witch 2 Book of Shadows. And I think there's a scene in that movie where they're at a spot in the woods where there is sort of the remnants of the foundation of a house, if my memory serves. And there is like partial walls. And I think we're blending that with the film because I had the exact same memory.
And the thing is, I don't really remember Blair Witch 2 other than I remember enjoying it and I remember everyone hating the crap out of it. Whereas Blair Witch 1, I kind of remember the opposite. Everybody was bonkers for this film. They loved it. It was the scariest thing ever. And certainly my brother was one who sort of saw the website and all that. And he was talking about how it was something that really happened. And I was skeptical even at the time. Probably because I'm such a contrarian asshole that everybody loving it means that I gotta find something to hate in it. And I don't think it would really fly nowadays. I think nowadays we are a little bit more jaded, especially of things we find online. To an extent.
Unless it comes from the government.
Fake news, man. Fake news. Except for, of course, QAnon, who's, telling us the secret truth through code that is obviously completely interpreted correctly, in spite of all of the issues with the interpretations. But that's just all part of the master plan that they have to save us from the libcucks, Anywho, back to the film.
I don't even have anything to add to that. I'm just going to sit back.
So ridiculous. But back to the film. Oh, man. Sorry. I distracted myself with that stupid QAnon sidetrack.
We were talking about the memories of the wall.
I have those weird memories of the wall, and otherwise I don't really remember anything. As far as my memory was concerned, the film might as well have been 20 minutes long.
It really is a lot of the same.
It is so much of the same.
It's super repetitive.
Walking around, complaining about it being cold, the shoes get wet, they get angry, they fight with each other several times. I noticed something that you noticed early on in the film is the person doing the interviews was aggressive as shit and would talk over the people she was interviewing. And it's like, stop that! Stop it! Don't do that. That is terrible and it's distracting.
If you're filming a documentary, if you're interviewing someone, you have to give that person the opportunity to actually talk and tell their story. You can coax and guide, but number
wait for
one,
them to stop talking.
if you're recording, don't do a lot of right, yep, like just shut the fuck up. Just let the person talk, get a nice clean audio track. And secondly, yeah, let the person talk. Don't she was really guiding the conversation. Now, I don't know if that was a character thing and that was supposed to be indicating that Heather isn't actually very good at what she does and she's just somebody with a lot of piss and vinegar and she's let's go do this thing.
She was saying everything has to be my way at the end there when she started sort of accepting blame for everything. But the entire thing was also, as we know now, ad-libbed. Perhaps all the interviews were also supposed to be ad-libbed, so she was trying to direct them during the interview.
She could have been, yeah.
Either way, it makes it for very awkward, very, very awkward. The two people fishing, however, was great. And they were banter, and the guy no, this is bullshit. Those guys were great. I loved those guys. There were some decent interviews, especially having one or two people who's yeah, I never heard of it. It's so nice and refreshing to actually get some people in there who are yeah, I don't know what the heck you're talking about.
There was a naturalism and a realism through those interviews and through most of the first 15, 20 minutes of the film, to be perfectly honest. The conceit of her having the camcorder as well as a 16mm camera.
Not that I could ever tell the difference between when one was shooting and the other.
Black and white and color. That was it. Black and white and color. That was it.
I didn't even notice that it was black and white.
Yeah.
That's how little made a difference to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the colors are really bland and uniform as well. But there's a really good scene in there where she wants to test the 16mm camera and she asks him to shoot a couple feet of film. And she's yelling at him to stop filming because you're going out with cans of film.
That stuff's expensive.
You don't want to waste film. Yeah, every foot of film is something that could be shot for your documentary and you're not just going to waste it in a hotel room. I really liked those moments. It added...
But then, to me, you're also wasting whatever cassettes you have. They might be cheaper, but are you using that for the documentary as well?
But you could also record over cassettes.
You can, but you're not going to do that prior to the editing process.
No, but you might. I mean,
through over everything.
If she knows that she spent the last 4 hours just walking around shooting stuff and nothing has happened, she could literally just rewind that tape and use it again. I mean, if she's got the film in her head. I don't... And I mean, she wasn't supposed to be using the camcorder as a...
For the documentary portion itself.
Yeah, it was kind of just documenting their journey and...
Documenting the documentary.
Kind of. I mean, the conceit, again, is it's there so that you can see what the characters are doing. And I think it's actually valid for, like I said, the first 15, 20 minutes. But after that, you can tell that the characters start using exposition in a very awkward, not naturalistic way. They start, walking into environments and going... Well, this is really spooky. Oh, this is the creepiest thing I've ever seen. And there's nothing to actually invoke that feeling in the viewer other than them telling you. There's that whole show, don't tell thing. I mean, it's film. You don't have a score, so you've got to find other ways to do it.
And it's just filling it up with just random banter. And sometimes that works. That really humanizes them in a lot of ways when they're just messing around and having fun or getting angry with each other later on. But
even the fights, though, you even said yourself, why are they filming all of these fights?
Oh, 100%. That's the thing. How is it that they happen to film when they stumble upon certain things? When they come out of the tent later on, and she's like, okay, we just got out of the tent, and I'm seeing these rock piles around us. That, entirely believable, because they would have gotten up, gone out, saw the rocks, went, shit, get the camera, film it, and then explain what they saw. But when they come across something and they just happen to have the camera out over 3-4 days of filming, then it's what? No, your camera wasn't out every single time you stumbled across something. That's ridiculous.
You could maybe argue, well, she's got the camera running because weird stuff has been happening, so she wants to be able to catch stuff as she's coming out of the tent. But if there's some supernatural creature waiting outside to grab me, I'm not going to come out with a camcorder stuck to my face. I want to be able to react. I want to be able to actually, do shit. So
that's actually one of the things that kind of catches me, having other films of this genre to compare it to. The view is fairly stable compared to a lot of other ones. In some of the other...
You mean in terms of shaky cam?
Yeah, in terms of shaky cam. Like, if you're running out of the tent and you're freaking out and everything's all scary, you'd expect the camera to just be everywhere. And some found footage, like, they'll have the camera where they're holding it and they're just pointing at the ground because they're hoofing it and they got their arms going. Here, the camera's always forward. When they were running through the woods after getting out of the tent because the laughing kid ghosts or whatever were playing around with their tent, Mike is chasing Heather, and she says, "Oh my God, what's that out of the corner?" And she's always right in the frame of the camera. She's always being focused on. Apparently, he was supposed to pan to the left and see, like the cinematographer or something like that, all dressed in white, but they didn't reshoot that. And so that was kind of a flub right there. And that's one of those show, don't tell kind of things. That was a huge mistake.
We discussed that at the time, where that required something. It really did require something. Like,
even just pan off to the left and show just some shakiness, even if there was nothing there, but to keep it trained on her. It's like when you're watching a show that's making fun of that trope, where they're like, "Oh my God, look over there, it's the craziest thing I've ever seen," and they just start describing the most ridiculous nonsense, all the while saying, "Wow, I can't believe what I'm seeing, it's amazing," just telling you how you're supposed to feel.
I can understand if someone wanted to make the argument that that bolsters the realism of it, because if she's like, "Oh my God, what's that over there?" He might still be running with the camera. He could turn his head to look, but the camera doesn't necessarily turn, because turning the camera while running...
But he's also not saying anything and also holding that camera up pretty steady as he's running, as opposed to going back and forth with the arm. Granted, the camera has a flashlight on it.
It does.
So that's a possibility.
It does.
Either way, it's still one of those things that it doesn't...
Despite the fact that it might bolster the realism that it doesn't turn, for the narrative and for actually building tension and making this a scary movie, they're already going against certain conventions of reality in order to push their narrative forward. This is one of those moments where I think the audience would have been, at least me as the audience, would have been much happier to have been thrown a bone. And that doesn't mean like Josh's teeth in a bloody rag. Actually, I think those were strips of his shirt.
It looked like it, yeah. It looked like a shirt just tied up and just left there that she opens up one-handed while holding the camera, because that's how you do things when you're this scared and everything.
Or when she's washing her hands and she's holding the camera. Like, these are the moments where after a certain point...
I'm just washing my hands. I'm going to put on my gloves. Everything is good.
After a certain point, it just stops even trying to maintain the sort of legitimacy of that camera being on. And it's just there to capture things.
At the same time...
Although they did try with Josh's line.
Because she does mention that I'm a documentarian. I want to capture absolutely everything. And with Josh's line where he's got the camera and he's like, "I see why you like the camera now. It's like I'm watching everything through a filter. Like, this isn't really happening to us," sort of deal. It's not quite really reality.
And she also says that filming is all that she has.
It's all that she has left. So there is a valid attempt. But even with that valid attempt, it feels like it's really shoehorned in there. And that's problematic.
It is. And honestly, I've yet to see a found footage film that manages to maintain that suspension of disbelief for me, that doesn't just break down into, we just need to have all these cameras fucking running so that everything gets captured.
Sorry, Rec.
Oh.
I thought they did a good job of maintaining it.
I think there's a lot of found footage movies that I've seen, and I haven't seen a lot, but there's a lot that are okay, and some of them are interesting enough that they sort of keep me captivated for a while. But
he hasn't seen Cloverfield. I think that's my favorite found footage, so we'll see how that goes.
And you told me about Cannibal Holocaust, which honestly, that was another thing that we were discussing about this film, because you were like, why would somebody assemble this footage in this way if you know that these kids are probably dead? Because it's played very much like a horror movie.
It's supposed to be 5 years earlier.
And the ending is like there's no commentary or explanation or discussion. And had this movie been put together as a documentary about these kids who disappeared and had some sort of commentary, like, you could have cut a lot of the bullshit out, a lot of the expository stuff, because you could have just had that omnipresent narrator.
Or even after the narrator mentions something about the kids, you show just like a little clip of them laughing, which humanizes them like they do in a normal documentary.
Or you could even have like Josh, Mike, and Heather maybe they conducted interviews with themselves before going on this journey and then used their conversations as voiceover for the bits. Like, it would have... I think this film needed to feel, especially since they were pushing it so much as being like real. I think this film, in order to maintain that
illusion, have to almost feel like the way you'd actually do a film, as opposed to creating essentially a whole new genre of film, which is what they did. There's a few found footage films that happened beforehand. The Last Broadcast, Cannibal Holocaust, as you mentioned. I didn't see any other on the wiki. I'm sure some of you might have seen one or two, but those ones had it done as a documentary style. They had very similar plots, very similar ideas, but they did have that extra layer which made it that much more believable. The director of Cannibal Holocaust was actually brought to court over having made that film and over people's deaths, and he had to prove that people were still alive. Like, that is the level of realism that Cannibal Holocaust had, whereas this one, not quite so much.
And I remember seeing the Sci-Fi Channel documentary, the Curse of the Blair Witch, and I remember enjoying that. I think it's on the DVD. I remember enjoying that more than I did the film itself. I found the film incredibly dull, and it's like 81, 85 minutes long, and it is longer than it needs to be. They could probably shave 10 minutes out of it. Josh needs to disappear sooner. I think there needs to be so much more conflict between, because Josh and Heather are the friends. Mike and Heather are the people who have just met. So to have Josh disappear and to have them have to deal with the idea of leaving the woods, it would have...
You could have Mike being like, no, let's get the hell out of here, because that's all he wanted. And
let's
Heather's
get out
like, no, we got to save Josh.
Let's get out and send someone back. The faster we get out, the faster we could send someone back. We're not equipped to help Josh. The idea of the woods just basically swallowing them up, and no matter how far they walk, they're always going to be in the woods. I think that could remain a subtext, but you'd have Mike and Heather really at odds with, do we leave the woods or do we stay in the woods? And it gives a reason to stay in the woods. And then you could taunt them.
And it could have gotten rid of the whole BS thing where Mike kicks the map into the creek. Like,
yeah.
That's asinine. It's utterly ridiculous. He
Literally
kicks the map
the
into
worst
the creek,
part of the movie.
And he lies about it for no reason. And if it was in her pocket the whole time, how did you sneak it out while you were sleeping and do that? Like, it's so questionable. Whereas, as you said, if Josh disappeared, then they'd have the thing where, what do we do? And they could follow the map and be like, no, this isn't right. This doesn't make sense. At the beginning of the film, she's talking about, okay, where did we start? We started off the map. But don't worry, I know where we're going. And it could be that when you get to a certain point, you end up off the map again. And then it's like, we're not on the map anymore. I don't know where it is. I don't know where we are. Or you find the same tree again. And it's like, no, we were just here. We were following this creek. How the hell are we back here? That doesn't even make sense. There's a lot of ways to do it without somebody kicking a map into a creek, which is absurd.
And it would have been much better to build tension. It would have been much better to get into the minds and the lives of these characters and the emotions of these characters. You have these tools. You have these cameras. You have this map. Use them. Like, they're really useful tools to tell this story. And one thing that I've never understood, because people are saying this is one of the scariest movies of all time. Where does it build tension? Where?
You're bouncing back and forth between drawn out arguments and them just being in the dark and looking at piles of rocks. I understand the whole keep an atmosphere of fear going on, but that doesn't really exist here. There's too little going on for it to build that atmosphere. There's not enough odd stuff. There's a couple piles of rocks and some sticks hanging from trees. And at one night, they have the laughing kid voices. I do like some of the sounds that they have going on in the background, but also, as you were saying while we were watching, you hear some sounds outside. It could be a bear. Don't run out. It could be a bear.
Don't shout at it.
Who's driving car? A bear driving car? How can this be?
How can this be? Yeah, it could be anything. It could be a cougar. It could be a bear. Like, the way that they are behaving, they're in the woods. They're all alone.
She supposedly likes going out to the woods as her favorite activity to do on the weekend, but apparently doesn't know you don't run out and start shouting at what might be vicious animals.
Now, we live in sort of a little bit northish Alberta, so I mean, we're used to a lot of kind of wildlife. I don't know what the wildlife is like in Maryland, but I feel like if you don't have bears, like there has to be some sort of carnivore that maybe wanders around in the woods and could potentially be a problem if you have no way to defend yourself.
Wolves, Appalachian hillbillies from Wrong Turn.
Well, they already thought that there was hillbillies. Fuck, that line that Mike has where he's like, can't be rednecks. Rednecks aren't this creative.
Actually, I prefer when he's not being racist against the Appalachians and instead says, like, I'm not going to play with that. Well, what if it is people? Yeah, they'd be chasing us out in the woods this far just to mess with us. I'm not playing with that. Well, what if it's not people? Yeah, I'm not playing with that either.
Yeah. And you know what? That reminds me of Evil Dead. When Sam Raimi and crew went up into the woods, but they actually did run afoul of hill people. And it was like a thing. It kind of weirded them out, and they were a presence that made people a little bit uncomfortable. And I kind of got that sense when we were watching this and the way that they were saying like there could be people out here living in the woods, because there literally are like pockets of people out in the middle of nowhere who are just off the grid, who are doing their own thing, and you have no idea who you're going to run afoul of. So that's legit. And
Except for that they have guns. They definitely have guns.
And I did love that line, just like you said, where he's just like, I'm not messing with it. Like, let's get out of here. Let's just go.
You have some like beautiful points of logic like that, followed by Mike, that same character, kicking the map into the goddamn creek.
And good acting, too.
Some very good acting.
And some terrible acting. I wondered if Mike kicking the map into the creek was supposed to be like the influence of the woods or something driving him crazy or driving him to it.
He kept shouting, the map is useless. And they kept shouting at him, you don't know how to read a map. That's fine. I know how to read a map. Don't kick the fucking map in the creek. Which, of course, makes sense. I'm not going to go to a doctor and say, whoa, 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 I don't know how an x-ray machine works, so I don't need none of your voodoo around here. This weird picture of my rib cage, this doesn't exist. It's craziness. I'm just going to burn it all down.
You brought up Record earlier, and the conceit there was it was a news crew. So you had the camera, you had a reason for there to be a camera.
And she's hoping to get her Pulitzer, so she's going to try to film as much as she can.
Yeah, she doesn't want to be the night crew anymore. She wanted to be an anchor. And honestly, even though that movie had its problems, you can go check out our Record Quarantine episode. I still liked Record as a whole. Like I felt there was some tension, there was some urgency. The panic was kind of real. It felt faker in a way, but it also felt a little bit better. And I think, I mean, when you hear about how this movie was made with the little messages being left behind and how they were really kind of just going from place to place and figuring shit out as they went along and having them get attacked at night and stuff like that, like that's all really fascinating.
But it's more interesting in a behind-the-scenes kind of way.
It sounds like a better movie than what actually happened in the editing room. And like 20 hours of footage, I got to assume that like 16 hours of it were just walking around and pointing at things in the woods.
Still took them 8 months to edit it down.
Well, I believe that. I mean, they were probably working like regular jobs or going to school or something too. Like probably wasn't full-time in the editing room, but
maybe they just weren't very efficient at it either. I don't know. Who knows? One of the things that sort of I questioned a little bit was the whole standing in the corner thing. I didn't remember where that came from going into this viewing, but it was in the interviews where they were talking about a sort of a serial killer from 20, 30 odd years ago who'd killed 7 teens and brought them out to sort of a cabin out in the woods. And he came back saying, it's done. And apparently he'd killed them one by one and had the other ones face the corner so that they weren't watching him. That somehow is brought in at the end where you have Mike standing in the corner after gingerly putting down the camera, but quickly, because he sure as heck didn't drop that camera. And you've got Heather screaming, so presumably it almost feels sort of like the killer was the one chasing them the whole time, if anything. Not necessarily the Blair Witch. They did have that sort of mystery. It could have been that the killer was possessed by the Blair Witch. None of these abilities or none of that has been introduced whatsoever at any other point, nor that there have been other cases of missing people beyond that one serial killer. So the other possibility could be that, hey, maybe there's another killer doing the same thing, influenced by the Blair Witch. And a lot of that could almost be interesting.
It would have been so cool. There's that moment near the beginning when they're still filming the documentary and she's reading in the cave from that book and telling you of the legend of Coffin Rock. If there were more bits of Heather reading bits.
And it would give you something to piece all together, because this whole Coffin Rock thing doesn't seem linked up to anything. It's like you've got 2 sets of murders plus somebody being burned as a witch way, way back when. And it's all a little bit mysterious.
Well, there's some kind of curse in the woods that has people killing people. I think that's what the curse of the Blair Witch is.
You could easily say that.
Honestly, I didn't feel the movie was super clear on the lore. It's been a while since we've seen the documentary of Curse of the Blair Witch.
Actually, I'm going to check that out afterwards here.
But I think whatever happened to the Blair Witch, there's a curse, and people out in the woods get affected by this curse. And I think that's why people were sacrificed on Coffin Rock. I think that's why there's something to do with like the 7 kids or 7 people, however many people get killed. And that's why
there's 5 men who were tied together at Coffin Rock. 7 kids were murdered by the other guy. And then the one witch. So you can't even look at the numbers. They talk about the strange symbols without really giving you much to go on. In some of the deleted endings, you got a better look of the symbols, but it was still completely irrelevant.
But even to have Heather have less moments of like walking around in nothingness, more moments of Heather kind of sitting there reading stories from the book or talking, like telling the other guys what the lore is, or if they actually did record her reading these bits from the book on their little journey while they were out, you could use it as voiceover.
Or even more interviews which had to do with more of these things going on at the beginning, because within 20 minutes, they're already heading back from the 2 places they wanted to visit. And I'm like, what kind of documentary are you making? You've got like 6 minutes of actual footage to use right now. And that is it.
Yeah, they visited a couple of sites. I mean, they obviously were just going out for a weekend. I don't think she planned on having the entire documentary filmed this weekend. They were going out there to get shots of the cemetery and to get a couple of like interviews with locals. And I think they accomplished that, and then they got lost out in the woods. Who knows how much more work she would have actually had to have done, how much research. That would have been
stuff that could have been mentioned by another documentary crew who were checking out these kids' disappearance.
It could have been. And to be fair, I fully acknowledge that hindsight is 20/20, and Myrick and Sanchez, they did the best probably with what they had, the finances, the resources that they had, the time, the people, everything. And we can look at it now and be like, oh, well, it would have been better to put this here or to put that there. But
long story short, they made $25 million off of $60 grand. So
$250 million.
$250 million off of $60 grand. That's good.
And that's not counting all the money they made off of selling their shit on eBay.
I mean, they started a phenomenon. They popularized a complete subgenre of horror. That is hard to do, to recreate another subgenre in as early as the turn of the millennium here. Like, I can't think of another real subgenre that's been created since then. In most any type of film, really. They did what they were going to do, but it was very much a time and place thing. Nowadays, we've seen too much of this. We've had so much more viral marketing that's come up over all sorts of things. You look at the Blair Witch sequel, not Book of Shadows, but the
2016 one.
The 2016 one. And I think that one works a lot better with the time that it was made, aka 3 years ago. And I think that one might actually have a bit more staying power as a film independently than if you were to go back and look at this one. But they work together very well. I'd almost like to see a bit of a supercut where you could do a documentary of the Blair Witch Project using only the stuff from the Blair Witch, and then cut out the end part of Blair Witch where people get caught. I'm wondering if that would work. I haven't seen it in a little bit. Just get some layers of meta in there, especially if you get a third documentary crew documenting the Blair Witch Project documentary.
I just want to apologize.
The Blair Witch documentary project.
Mike's mom.
Of the Blair Witch Project.
And Josh's mom.
It would be layers upon layers.
And
Let's do it, people. Let's even throw a third one in there that didn't actually get created or released. Just to fill up time.
Somebody make that and we'll
was very
contribute to
naive.
your Patreon.
I am so sorry for everything that has happened. Because in spite of what Mike says now, it is my fault. Because it was my project. And I insisted. I insisted on everything. I insisted that we weren't lost. I insisted that we keep going. I insisted that we walk south. Everything had to be my way. And this is where we've ended up. And it's all because of me that we're here now. Hungry and cold and hunted.
So I think we should get to the final roundup here.
I think that's totally fair. Should I go first or you?
Have at.
I honestly, there was a point within the first 15, 20 minutes of this movie where I thought I was going to go masterpiece. I thought, wow, if this actually holds up, even though I'm not super interested, it's kind of maintaining its conceit. And I feel like it failed at that. I feel like it failed at building tension. It's not a scary movie. It was a phenomenon. It did really touch a nerve at the time. All the things that we've acknowledged, but I have to go with Museum Piece because it is a cultural artifact. It is a cultural touchstone. But as a film, I don't think it's really all that great. I don't think it really holds together. And it's just, I don't even think it's really all that well put together. Did I already say that?
A few times.
So, Museum Piece for me. How about you, Dustin?
I'm actually surprisingly torn. Like, I know I'm so contradictory. I'm just a big oppositional asshole. And so I know a lot of my dislike of the film comes from just the sheer amount of popularity and it not living up to the hype of it being scary and how jaded I was even back then. I was actually leaning towards masterpiece because there is a lot of good acting. There is a lot that is done very well. Even if you take out some of the minor flaws, but there's just the major flaws of a lot of the actions which take me out of the film. It did, as you said, change a lot in the film industry, and it did show what could be done with so little. And honestly, I have some ideas that I think might be able to do the same, but I don't have the filmmaking cred to ever get that done. But so many things just take me out of the film, and a lot of the actions interspersed with the really believable stuff are just ridiculous, and it becomes very not believable, especially having other films of the subgenre to compare it to at this point. Hindsight 2020, sure, but a masterpiece has to be able to live beyond its inception. And so it goes into the museum.
I think it's interesting that we had this movie after La Haine because I think we might have mentioned it on the last episode when we were talking about that film. It actually sparked a revolution in filmmaking in France. I mean, it was a kind of a low-budget guerrilla filmmaking thing. It was talking about really relevant, like social, it was a really real kind of film, and it had a lot of impact, and it was super potent, and it inspired people to kind of go out and make film. This movie also did that because you do so much with so little, and people are, I mean, there's a reason why a whole subgenre has been born out of it, like
your Paranormal Activities, your Cloverfields, your Rex.
All you need is a freaking smartphone and an idea, and you've got...
The first movie filmed entirely on a smartphone came out, last year?
Unsane, yeah, Steven Soderbergh. Of course Steven Soderbergh, because he's amazing. But, again, I saw this originally in 99. Wasn't interested. Watched it again now. Wasn't interested. The other stuff about it is more interesting to me. Watching it with the commentary was more entertaining than watching the film itself. In the commentary, they're talking about all the equipment that they broke and sold on eBay for like $10,000, and it would almost felt like watching the Shopping Channel for a little while. It's like, oh, that went for like $2,000. Oh, that went for whatever.
Her real snot from that scene was in a Kleenex that we sold for $400.
It's like you were saying, a masterpiece has to live beyond its kind of moment of inception, its period of history where it kind of exploded out into the culture. And the most interesting thing about this movie is what this movie did and how this movie got made and how this movie got marketed and its sort of place in cinema history rather than the film itself. And that's...
A good documentary on it might be a masterpiece.
Yeah, and I think there were ways that they could have tweaked this, and I would have been happy to have gone masterpiece. But like, we voted La Haine to be masterpiece, and I think that's an interesting sort of way of... They're two very different movies, but in a way they're kind of spiritually similar.
Which is going to lead us into next month's worth of films. Because we're going to be going into our October Fright Fest Spooktacular, where we will be comparing and contrasting Universal monster films.
I'm going to let that segue go. But yeah, our October Fright Fest Spooktacular, as Dustin said, Universal Monsters this year. We're going to start with Dracula in the first week of October.
The original 1931 Dracula.
Todd Browning's Dracula. And
not Nosferatu, because that one wasn't Universal. And
we're going to compare it to Universal's reboot attempt, which was Dracula Untold, which I think came out in like 2015, 2014?
16?
Was it
18,
16?
17?
It was...
Within the last millennia. You know what? I'll narrow it down. Within the last century.
Watch for that. And we'll let you know on that episode what our next Universal Monsters movie will be. And we'll leave you to speculate as to where we're going to go. I mean, there's obviously about a half a dozen Universal Monster films that we can play with. Yeah. So if you have some opinions, if you have any thoughts on this episode or any episode, feel free to give us a shout. You can catch us online. We are at FYC Show or For Your Consideration on all the social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We've got the WordPress blog, which is fycshow.wordpress.com, I believe. And we also have a Patreon if you want to support the show. As always, share, like on the social media. Spreading the word that way is amazing. But if you want to support the show a little more robustly, help us keep the lights on, develop some more robust programming. I'm using robust a lot, I think. Hit our Patreon, patreon.com/FYC show, and check out at reward levels, see what's comfortable for you, and do what thou wilt. So that's it for us for this spin around the round table. 2 thumbs down, 2 museum piece votes for the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah, I think a real thumbs down is when we're like, yeah, it gets neither.
Thanks so much for joining us. Be sure to tune in next time. Until then, I've been your host, Mike.
And I've been Dustin.
Take care.
Ta-ta. A bird just flew out the window. But
I think that's our tag.
it's weird because we're in a basement.